Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, he wanted me to do it, for one thing. But really, it's because I'd written a previous biography of one of his heroes, idols, Whittaker Chambers, a famous Cold War figure. And that came out in the late 90s. And Buckley had been an important gatekeeper for that book. If somebody wouldn't answer a phone call, and in those days, it was phone calls and letters that you did, right? Useful though you are, you remember how you used to have to put a letter in the mail and hope somebody would respond to it. And Buckley knew everybody, left and right, and so he could open doors. And the left and right thing is really important. Buckley was much bigger than his politics and ideology. You knew him. He was a very large, humane, capacious person. I talked to a young journalist the other day who wanted to interview me for a story on the Met Gala, the Costume Institute party, which Buckley's wife, Pat, essentially invented out of whole cloth for Anna Wintour, took it over. And this young guy said to me, he just described Bill Buckley in these really disparaging terms, endlessly. And I finally said, so why do you think he was friends with people like Julian Bond, the great black activist, Jesse Jackson, who died recently? Buckley helped discover Jackson as a public figure. Murray Kempton, the great liberal columnist, John Kenneth Galbraith, Norman Mailer, the great writer. Why do you think they were friends with Buckley? And he said, maybe they thought they could redeem him, he said. And I said, well, isn't it possible they thought he was funny and smart and great company and humane and generous and caring and warm, that he could actually be those things, even if he took the wrong side of whatever political issue was in front of you? And I think today you can't do that. It's simply not acceptable. And that is a major loss, as we know, because you do this as well as I do. You move in and out of different universes of people, and they all have things to say. You want to listen to them and find out who they are, where they're from. Buckley was that way. Very famous man.
So you think we're too polarized?
Oh, absolutely we are. We're polarized in an uninteresting way because you can predict what everyone's going to say almost before they say it. One of the first interviews I did for this book, a very long one, was with Andrew Sullivan, who's also a very interesting journalist who occupies different areas. And he said to me, after he'd read the book, he said two things really struck him. He said, one is, if you set aside Gore Vidal, who had a very contentious personal dispute with Buckley, that was televised, is very famous, I read about it in the book, and there's a film about it. He said, no one has a bad word to say about Buckley. They never say a bad word about him personally, which had not even occurred to me as I was working, because he's engaged in disputes and debates all the time. The other thing he said was, Andrew said that he himself, Andrew Sullivan, was raised in England, Irish background, very devout Catholic working class family. Now, Buckley came from a self-made upper class, but very Catholic family. And Andrew said, you can tell that Buckley lived his life according to what they teach you in Sunday Mass, to be a good Christian every day. And Buckley did that. Even when the book describes the disturbing racial history in the Buckley family, on a personal level, they could not have been kinder, more humane, and more generous. And people think that when I say that about him, I'm either excusing him. No, you can see the facts in the book. They've never been told before, and shocking to some people, a little surprising to me. But that doesn't diminish how he acted as a human being day to day in his life. We are not the sum of our opinions. I'll turn the question around on you, Jacob. If we can say that people are no better than their opinions, then we have a world, let's say you're a liberal Democrat, of maybe 48 to 51% of godly saints walking among us because they check the right box for every question put before them. You really think it's that easy to be a virtuous and interesting and worthwhile person? I don't think so.
So if we look at this saga of New Deal and the conservative movement that emerges in opposition to it, has the conservative movement actually proven to have more longevity, to have legs, as it were, because the New Deal really sort of flamed out with Jimmy Carter, the coalition. And conservatism increasingly looks like the dominant force, the one that Buckley first helped weld into being.
Yeah, I think that's a very possibly true. And the reason is that movements run out of steam, run out of gas, lose their energy when they succeed. There were so many great triumphs that came out of the New Deal. Just look at the legislation passed under Roosevelt and then his great protege, who was not John F. Kennedy, of course, it was Lyndon Johnson. And then the third, I think, was Barack Obama, much underrated president in my view. So if you look at the great domestic policy that they gave us, it's extraordinary. And what it did, paradoxically, was make it easier for the conservatives to accuse them all of being social engineers. And also, more important, I think, shift the debate back to the cultural battle. So you go, what's going on in the places Buckley was writing about very early on. Buckley's father, who was in many ways his inspiration, early on, I found this, said, I don't see why people worry about political campaigns. Who cares who wins elections? I want to know who's teaching my kids in the classroom. So when conservatives saw that as the field of battle, then they found an almost endlessly fruitful area of combat. Look at the proposal, that the report that just came out of Yale University, largely written by quite a good friend of mine, Beverly Gage, great historian, who wrote something about, in favor of this book. I mean, she's one of our major historians now, very much a liberal Democrat. And what does she say? She said the universities are kind of coming apart for the same reason Bill Buckley said. In fact, a couple of years ago, when this book was not yet published, and I was at dinner with her, and I said to her and her husband, who's also a really consequential historian, John Witt, Yale Law School, I said, Buckley won, didn't he? He said, oh, yeah, he won. Why? He wanted to put donors and alumni in charge of universities. He got it right, So in that sense, you could say that conservatives, because their ideology is more deeply anchored, maybe, in history and tradition. One of your mentors, Irving Kristol, would probably have said that back in the 1990s. He would have said, of course the conservatives are right. They're drawing on a deeper tradition. Leo Strauss, somebody whose work you know very well, would say the same thing. You're going back to more ancient sources. And it turns out to be this kind of reprobate who's leading the revolution. But it doesn't mean the revolution does not, too many double negatives here, but the revolution can still speak through him, even if he's not sure.
So you're speaking at the Cosmos Club tonight.
Yes.
In a couple hours.
Yeah.
What's going to be the takeaway? Is it going to be to the audience, you need to take conservatism and Trump seriously?
Well, I don't know. Well, you won't answer questions yourself. I really don't know what
I'm the questioner.
Yes, I know. But I don't know what the audience is interested in. I know the man who's interviewing me, which is how they do it, which is great, makes it easier for the author. Went to Yale as Buckley did, and he told me a story. He said he met Buckley once. He's somewhat younger. Buckley was class of 50, but because of the GI Bill, Buckley was really in his middle 20s when he graduated, as many of his classmates were. This man, Phil Copper, graduated in 59. And he said, I met Bill Buckley once at the Fence Club, which is a very elite fraternity and drinking club at Yale. The kind where you remain a member, all your life. And Phil learned that Buckley was coming to campus, and Phil was trying out, they call it healing, Heeling, for the Yale Daily News. So I said, I'd like to write a story about you. And Buckley said, well, meet me at the Fence Club and bring your typewriter. So Buckley and his glamorous wife, Pat, showed up at the Fence Club. Phil Copper brought his typewriter. Bill Buckley took it from him, sat at the table, and wrote the story himself. He typed 120 words a minute. He just dashed it off like one of his columns. He wrote his column in 20 minutes. So is this an audience that wants to hear about the larger-than-life, bon vivant, man who knew how to live well? that's what we'll see. Or, as you've indicated in other contexts, hey, we're in Washington. Let's talk about policy. Let's talk about politics. Let's talk about Cuba or Iran or the end of the Cold War. Buckley was absolutely beside himself when Richard Nixon opened the door to China. And then his friend Theodore White, the great journalist, said to Buckley, well, you're going to go there, aren't you? And it hadn't occurred to Buckley to go along with the entourage for this historic opening of China, which I'm old enough to remember. It was the very beginning of 1972. Buckley was one of 3 columnists who were invited. It was mainly television, the television crews, and news people. So Barbara Walters became famous for her morning show, her Today Show broadcast from China, the time difference, and they had color TV, and we're doing all this for the first time. Buckley was one of 3 columnists. He was shocked by how, this will sound very strange to you, how obsequious Richard Nixon seemed in the company of Zhou Enlai, who was, while Mao was dying, was running the Chinese empire. There wasn't much of an empire then. Buckley was a sailor. And so he thought he had the foresight to bring binoculars with him. So when they were in the huge banquet hall in Beijing, Buckley peered through the binoculars and could see the sweat on Nixon's face as he went from table to table, kind of bowing and scraping. And Buckley wrote one of those brilliant polemics about that, which I describe in the book. He said, this was like seeing the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trial go over to pump the hand of Joseph Goebbels. That's Buckley on Nixon and China. So I'd say he's relevant today.
But so Buckley was, in essence, sort of a freedom fighter, wasn't he? When it came to the Cold War in Europe, he was very tough on communism and the Soviet Union.
He would have loved your calling him that. And now, Buckley and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Remember the famous line John McCain, who was a friend of Buckley's, had about Putin. I look at him and I see the KGB. Buckley wrote spy novels that included KGB agents. He knew a lot. He had been in the CIA, as you say. His mentor, his boss, was E. Howard Hunt, who did important psychological warfare and propaganda missions in Latin America, in Guatemala, and then later, not so successfully, in Cuba. But Buckley was really tied into that world. He would have known who Vladimir Putin was. The idea of an American president there, it's pretty hard to imagine Buckley feeling good about that, just as his friend, Skull and Bones colleague, and Bohemian Grove campmate, George H.W. Bush, would have had some issues with it too.
Yeah. So to sum it up, Buckley remains relevant today.
More so than ever. He's somebody we can all learn from, beginning with me. I went back and looked at the Castro pages I have again, because I just wanted to see exactly what Buckley had to say. And he was so far ahead of where the left was on that. He predicted that missiles were coming from the Soviet Union 2 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah, he's relevant.
Sam, thank you.
Thank you, Jacob.